You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Hey everybody, it's Remso. I want to thank you so much for making our first year of On the Run as big as it's been. I never knew I'd be coming back to podcasting in the way I did, especially here at the We Are Libertarians Network, but coming to you twice a week, doing the monologues, doing all these awesome panel shows with the Degenerate panel, my friends, getting to bring on so many awesome guests talking about ghosts, aliens, different lifestyles, different crazy things about the world. It has been such a journey and such an experience to be here with you. And as we cap off the year, I want to let you know about an awesome project I do with Marc Clair from Lions of Liberty. As you know from this show and on social media, I'm a giant comic book nerd. Earlier in August, Marc and I launched a podcast that we do on our own called the Second Print Comics Podcast. We come to you every Wednesday for like around 2 hours or so, doing deep dives into the comic book stories and characters we love. I'm actually going to go ahead and play for you the first episode of that show today. If you like it, please go ahead and check us out at secondprintcomics.com and Second Print Pod all over social media, but more importantly, the Second Print Comics Podcast wherever podcasts are available. Have a safe and happy new year. I'll be back with new shows and everything next week. Until then, enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are now entering the Second Print Comics Podcast, starring Marc Clair and Remso Martinez.
You wanted it, you demanded it. And for those of you that didn't know what you wanted and didn't know what you didn't want, here we are. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the premiere, the inaugural, the spectacular, the astonishing, the journey into mystery that is the Second Print Comics Podcast. I am your, absolutely elated host, Remso W. Martinez. I'm here with my good friend in comic fandom and everything else. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Marc Clair. Marc, thank you for joining me on this journey. I'm looking forward to doing everything with you as we go ahead and jump into the wild and crazy world of fandom, pop culture, film, animation, everything that is the wild and wacky world of comics.
Well, Remso, I'm thrilled to be here as your almost as elated, nerdy host here on the Second Print Comics Podcast. This has been a project that has probably been brewing in my mind for a long, long time. I mean, you might even say before podcasts even existed, right when my love for comic books and comic book characters, animated series all began. I think this has always been a passion of mine. My fanhood has ebbed and flowed at times, depending on life circumstances, but I always come back. Comic books are the one thing that I always come back to. And recently I was just thinking about how I wanted to branch out. I wanted to start to get into more areas. Both you and I have been podcasters for over 5 years each here. And I wanted to get out of my normal box and get into different areas. And one thing I could think about, I was thinking to myself, man, I really wish I could find time to read more comics, to go back and read more older comic book stories, to maybe read some newer things I'm not familiar with. And I said, but I can't justify all this time. I'm trying to build a career here. I'm trying to build new hobbies, build new projects. And then it dawned on me, what if I made reading comics one of my new projects? So here we are. And you were the first person I thought of. We did a little mini project, which we never even finished, actually, reviewing Doomsday Clock, which we'll probably go back to when we talk about Watchmen at some point. But I think we developed a pretty good rapport. I think we have similar thoughts about comics, but also have very different opinions. So I think we're going to have a really good mix here.
Absolutely. Now, folks, this is the Secret Origins episode because, Secret Origins, because every podcast is somebody's first podcast, just like the Grandmaster Stan Lee used to say every comic is somebody's first comic. And for those of you that don't know us, this is a great opportunity for us to really reset the continuity on this. I promise I'll stop with the puns in a moment, but really, as Marc said, this is something that you had been wanting to jump into, because if you love something and you're good at something, you might as well learn how to make it into something you can do do professionally. And I really feel like the Rick Jones to your Hulk in this situation, because when you brought me in, I was just like, okay, I've got like super nerd ADHD here. I want to talk about X and Z and Y and all this other stuff. This is good because we didn't talk much about the finer details. This is really us just riffing off of each other, folks, because this is a new experience for us both. We come from different backgrounds in terms of, what each of our other shows are about. And you can find out more about us in the show notes, of course. But Mark, I've got to ask, when did this burning passion start for you years back? And what really prompted you to jump back into wanting to get back into comics? Because this is, truthfully, one of those hobbies that when you're getting into the comic book continuity itself, it can get really dicey. You're dealing with retcons and deaths and reboots of reboots and triple all new fantastic reboots. And then with the movies, everything just gets more complicated. What started it way yonder back, because you're slightly older than me. Just a little bit, just a tick. He's not in the AARP demographic yet, folks.
Not quite yet. But someday, if this podcast goes well, I'll still be podcasting in that demographic, hopefully, many, many years in the future.
AARP will be Sponsoring us,
exactly. Yo. Second Print Comics podcast brought to you by AARP. Rick, is that you?
Remember when they were only 12 cents in my day?
So if you're my Rick Jones, which Hulk am I? Am I the irradiated Hulk? Am I smart green Hulk? Am I the somewhat in the middle, somewhat droll gray Hulk? It's all very confusing.
Gray Hulk is the only good Hulk, in my opinion.
Really? We could have a whole episode about debating the Hulks. See, there's so many possibilities here.
See, folks, you don't know what's happening. We didn't plan this. I didn't know that Mark had poor taste in Hulks, and now we do. But please, continue.
I think the best Hulk is original Savage Hulk. That's the best Hulk. Although I do have an affinity for Peter David's which we saw in Avengers Endgame, the basic same version of the monstrosity, the body of the Hulk, and the intelligence of Bruce Banner. It's kind of a cheat, but I did enjoy Peter David's run, which is probably something we'll end up going through at some point, his run in the 90s with that character. So anyway,
absolutely.
This isn't about the Hulk. This isn't about Peter David. We'll get to all this stuff down the road. But as far as my secret origin goes, well, my comic geekdom, my fandom started well before yours. And it might have started before you were born, actually. Why don't we just break it down? When were you born? 91? 92?
94. I know 94. I look like an either extremely young older person or an extremely depressed younger person.
And the truth is somewhere in the middle.
It's vague.
All right. Well, I started reading comics, I would say, around 1990 or so, and things were not like they are now.
I was still a swimmer.
Yeah, you're still swimming around in there. But for me, it came about. I was already a nerd. I was into nerdy things. Like I was into, things that aren't as nerdy now or much nerdier then. Pro wrestling's kind of nerdy now, but it's pretty mainstream now. Now it's on like Fox and ESPN. So I was into that stuff. I was into comic books. A friend of mine who I used to go over and watch wrestling with, he was really into comic books. So I started to kind of like just flip through his comic books because I really knew nothing about them at the time. And I really was just mesmerized. We don't do words here, all right? We just talk. I was mesmerized by I think a lot of the art that I saw, because a lot of the big artists of the time were, that was when guys like Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, Jim Lee, they were becoming really big within Marvel. This is before the split over to Image, which we will cover in great detail in future episodes. But I think when you're a kid, you're probably captured a lot more by the art, just because we're more visually inclined. And around that same time, we started to see some of the animated series come out as well. And I was, of course, hooked on cartoons. It's all I watched. And so we saw X-Men, the animated series, come out, which just blew my mind. And that came out around.
That is still like the magnum opus of superhero animation, even now. I was watching
Batman the animated series is another. That's my gold standard personally, but they're both going to be hard to top in the future, because now it seems like the cartoons are more about flash than they were substance. Although a lot of this is filtered through the fact that our 10-year-old or 12-year-old or 14-year-old brains view things one way, and your adult brain might view it differently. Like I originally started to go back through the X-Men on Disney Plus, and I want to say it holds up. It does hold up for a kid, but it doesn't hold up as much for an adult. Just a lot of the writing, the style, the cheese factor that I didn't feel as an adult. I mean, as a kid, I felt, man, this is so awesome. This is so serious. And it was very serious, actually. I was actually shocked by the violence of the animated series.
I mean, things like that coming from, because you're right at the end of the Bronze Age of comics when you mention those folks. That's really at the Bronze Age, and it's really entering the modern age. And cartoons like X-Men, the animated series, stuff like the McFarlane Spider-Man run, that stuff is still considered like quintessential fandom lore right now. There's a lot of stuff that I've seen, even just the last couple of years, where I've asked myself, will I want to read this or will I want to watch this a decade from now, and will it still hold up as being objectively good? And I can't really say that.
For that 90s stuff, yeah, I mean, a lot of it kind of depends, because I've gone back to a lot of the stories that captured me over the years. I mean, I think the biggest stories that captured me once I got into fandom, and these are all stories you'll probably hear in the first few episodes that we've already mapped out here, but a big one was Maximum Carnage to me, because I just thought the character of Venom and then Carnage were just so cool. They were just so visually cool. Like the visual of Venom with who basically looked like a dark, evil Spider-Man with these giant teeth. And that is when you started to see this concept more, which crept in a lot, somewhat in the 80s, but more so in the 90s, of the idea of the anti-hero, the sort of bad good guy. And Venom was one of those first, like, really, really bad good guys. Like, this is not a hero. He's definitely bad. He murders people, well, sometimes he teams up with Spider-Man because they have a common foe in Carnage, who's even more scary and wants to go on a murderous...
Yeah, he's the crystal meth of supervillains.
Yeah, exactly. First you're hanging out with Venom and you're just doing a little heroin, and it's not good for you, but you're just hanging out. And then Carnage busts in on crystal meth and you're like, whoa, whoa, whoa.
What's happening here?
Yeah. Hardcore drug comparisons were one of the many things I wasn't expecting to get into in the very first episode.
It gets real, folks. Live with us.
This is how we roll. This is how we roll. Things go where they go. So yeah, I think, but around then, I started to get captured by that stuff. And some of these, right around the time I started to get into comics, is when a lot of these huge, huge, huge stories came out. I mean, Maximum Carnage was pretty big for Marvel, but way bigger than that were two stories, both from DC. The biggest one, of course, being the death of Superman. And I was maybe loosely reading comics or loosely getting interested in comics at the time of the death of Superman, but I remember I was hearing about this on the news. Like, I would go home after school and the local news person would be talking about the upcoming death of Superman. And this just, I was familiar with Superman just from the 80s movies, the Christopher Reeves movies, which I don't know how well they hold up. I actually haven't watched them in a long time, so maybe we'll have to go back and do some movie reviews at some point. I'm kind of curious.
I'm a Richard Donner apologist, so we'll definitely have to do that.
I can't apologize for Superman 2, though.
We don't talk about Superman 2.
That didn't happen.
We don't talk about a lot of the Supermans, but we talk about the first one.
We could build a really great chronology just picking which movies we want and acting like they go together, like Richard Donner's Superman, and then maybe we follow up with the Snyder Cut is the next movie.
Oh my Lord. This is one of those topics where you definitely see a changing mentality in comics. And I think when I started reading in like the early 2000s, like around 2001 specifically, because I remember buying a lot of 9/11 themed issues. And no, we're not going to get into, the superhero ethics of 9/11 response right now. But like around that time, there wasn't a lot changing drastically, because a lot of the stuff that you're mentioning, Absolute Carnage, Death of Superman, that stuff was still permeating within comics when I was jumping in. But it's really strange. When I started reading like around 6 or 7, I learned to read through comic books. I refused to read actual books. I learned to read through comic books. It's the only way my parents could get me to read and actually retain information. They would quiz me on what was going on within the story. It's really funny because even then, because at that point what you have is you have the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, and then you have the X-Men films and the Blade films. Comic books was still very much, even though, a lot of the storylines and stuff were getting into the more mature themes, especially of Daredevil coming out a few years later, it was still very much seen as, an outlet, a medium for children. And that was
Right,
something I was
right.
still seeing up until when the first Iron Man came out. Now everyone and their grandma and their hot cousin loves the superhero genre itself. It's everywhere. What was it like when you were getting in at that point?
Yeah, it was definitely something that was seen for kids at the time. I think probably all through the time that I was a fan. I mean, the only people that I talked about comic books with were like the very small group of friends that I knew also read comic books, and I never talked about it with anybody else. You know, I wasn't reading comic books like at the lunch table in school or anything like that because I was frankly embarrassed. Like it was seen as such like a kid nerdy thing, even when I was like 12, 13, 14, especially as I got older, as I got more into high school, and now people are going to parties and we're doing more teenagey cool things. And I'm doing some of that too, but I'm still going home and reading comics afterwards. You know, I'm still taking the $20 a month, $20 a month, $20 a week, or whatever it is that I earned from mowing lawns and doing little odd jobs. Pretty much every dime of that I took to the comic store and got whatever comics I could get. Because it was one of my many outlets. I wasn't an only child, technically. I have a sister who's 12 years older than me, but due to that age difference,
that's a bit of a disconnect.
It's a bit of a disconnect, yes.
Yeah.
So she moved out of the house and went to college when I was 5. So while not technically an only child, I kind of was an only child, and I learned to just spend a lot of time alone. Like I like doing things alone. So one of those things was just diving into the world of comic books, and they really just sparked my creativity. I'd already been a big reader growing up. Like my parents always read books to me at night, and I was always fascinated by books, like by just more of the fantasy type stuff. Like I really got into the Chronicles of Narnia and that sort of thing. So when I found comic books, it was really just a natural extension of my sort of inner nerdiness. It was like, wow, there's these awesome stories and this amazing art. Oh, and I can sit down and read it in like 15 minutes. And then that's just the initial impression. But then you start to really understand the deeper chronologies and the history of this stuff, and you realize there's 60, 70 years of history, and you start to try to wrap your brain around all of it. And like you mentioned towards the beginning of the show, it can feel overwhelming, especially as a new fan. I didn't think too deeply about it then. I just read the books I liked and tried to follow along. Marvel and DC were always good about the little asterisks, like when a character would explain something that happened, like, oh, like
Go
that
back
time
to issue 12.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, okay, now I'm supposed to go to the comic book store and go find, Black Cat number 13 or whatever it is. So I think now, though, that's one of the things I want to capture with this podcast, because in the last 10 years or so, with all the interest that has come into, especially you have to give most of the credit to, I think, the MCU, because they really did they took basically, I wouldn't say unknown characters, but by far not their biggest character.
Iron Man alone was a B-lister. I mean,
Sure.
Iron Man was B-list. When you look at like the Guardians of the Galaxy, I didn't even touch that stuff growing up because they were just so obscure and just so they were the cameos of cameos, so to speak. They were referenced every once in a while and they would pop up as guests, but it was not what you were going to think would launch a multi-billion-dollar film franchise.
Not at all. And it was almost a blessing that Marvel was sort of hamstrung because they had gone through the bankruptcy and they had to give up the movie rights to a lot of their characters to stay solvent. That's why they had given up their movie rights to the X-Men. I think technically Hulk 2 was Universal, but they worked out some deal with the Hulk.
Yeah, they still own that. That's why they can never make a Hulk film. So he can cameo in all their stuff, kind of like Spider-Man, but they're holding on to that because as soon as they start seeing Marvel with the lower end budget films, because Iron Man was a lower end budget film. That's why you see a lot of practical effects in the first couple MCU films, and now it's all green screens and CGI.
Yeah.
So when they saw they could do that, they were like, why would I want to get rid of it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. But I think there's been an explosion because of the explosion in the MCU movies. I mean, we can give some reference to Man of Steel and some of DC's projects. Some have been successful. Some have been kind of blah. They've put their efforts in, but really it's the MCU that I think is responsible for the current comic books explosion, the consistency of the storytelling, the fact that they put together 23 movies that all tie together. I mean, stuff from Captain America, the First Avenger, ties into the ending of Endgame. I mean, it's just incredible. And I think that becomes such a good jumping on point for fans, because now there's all these fans out here that find out about these characters, fall in love with these characters through the movies, But now there's no movies right now. And a lot of these fans are going to be looking to other avenues and other venues to learn more about these characters. So what I hope to do is not just send people to the current comic book store, although we both encourage people to visit their comic book stores, their physical brick and mortar comic book stores, whenever they can, especially with everything that's been going on this year. A lot of those stores are seeing a lot of trouble. But what I really want to encourage people to do is go back and kind of learn more about these characters, learn more about the stories that shaped the comic book industry, perhaps before they even knew about it, for people that came in maybe during these MCU years, or maybe find some people somewhat like me, the lapsed fan. Now, I'm not an entirely lapsed fan, but I have ebbed and flowed with the current products over the years. There are times that I'm hardly reading anything at all current. There's times that I'm diving way, way, way in. When DC Rebirth came out, I bought that one-shot issue, and man, that book captured me so much that I basically was a DC fanatic again for 2 years. But I slowly started to fade away from those books until Tom King finally kicked me in the nuts and sent me running away. But we can get to him in a later episode. That's one of our biggest contentious points.
The God King, Tom King. You bring up something which is so important, which is now, and this is the question that I've received from some people that messaged us messaged me on Twitter and Facebook. Why? Because you can go on iTunes, you can go on YouTube and other places, and there are really great comic channels. There are a lot of comic channels where they talk about some of the things we're going to talk about. But the thing is, it's still very recent, and I could still remember the day I walked out of the 2008 Iron Man film after that scene where Robert Downey Jr. said, "I am Iron Man," and I knew that things were going to change fast, but it would still take a while for people to really commit to it. It's almost like fandom has become acceptable in a way where now we can talk about it. And now when you go to a barbecue or you talk with people at work, people are interested in this stuff because what they finally seen is that comic books, one, they're a uniquely American art form. Of course, we got to give respect to the manga and anime of Japan. But really, when we look at the superhero genre itself, it's very uniquely American. And it's something that there's a flavor for everybody, from neo-Westerns like Logan to far-fetched features such as, Endgame itself. This is really something that more people are discovering now. They have a passion for, even if they don't consider themselves fans. And like what Mark said, folks, we want to go ahead and facilitate the conversations about the stories that really helped make us, in a way, as fans, and really helped make the world we're living in now. Because if there's ever a time where people really want to start fresh without the baggage, they want a Reader's Digest version of the things that they can potentially jump into further, we want to be that show for you and for everyone. Because fandom is fun. Fandom is, I think, genuinely, it's one of the few things that will ultimately keep American culture going. Despite all the things going on in the news, wherever you are on any given topic, when I go to AwesomeCon in DC, I see everybody. I see the fabulous furry freaks and the whole bunch of it. They are there and they are different. And we might be, drastically contrasting individuals, but we're there for the love of fandom. And that's what we want to be as a service to you.
Yeah, it's really amazing how far, like you referenced, that this idea of fandom has come, especially when it comes to comic books. I kind of relate it to my other geeky passion of professional wrestling. When I was maybe 10, 12 years old, I was watching Hulk Hogan and Macho Man, but I really only talked about it with my one or two safe friends who I knew were cool wrestling friends. But then suddenly in the late 90s, you had Stone Cold Steve Austin get really popular. You had the Monday Night Wars. You had Hulk Hogan joining the NWO. This might be lost on many people, but I think a lot of people will know what I'm referencing because it became so immersed in pop culture to the point that now the cool kids at school, the jocks, were wearing Austin 316 shirts. Meanwhile, 3 years earlier, I was hiding the fact that I ever even looked at that stuff. So it's really interesting how fandom changes. And I think we've seen a huge shift in how specifically comic books and comic book fandom is perceived. I think there's a couple kind of fans I want to reach with this show. One is like I call myself a Lapsed fan. I'm not really a Lapsed fan. I'm more like a
the prodigal fan.
Yes, I'm a prodigal fan. I've never stopped being a fan ever, but my interest in the current product is what kind of ebbs and fades. But I want to find people that were maybe fans during my era, during the 90s, people that were maybe just becoming fans during your era. That's maybe the mid 2000s that you started to become a fan?
Definitely the mid 2000s. And I really call it like the pre-MCU years, because for a lot of folks, when you mention, how did you get into superheroes? Most of the time now, especially for a lot of millennials, it came from the films. But it wasn't even films like Iron Man. It was the Fox X-Men series, which I really do think, like X2, X-Men United is still, I think, one of the best superhero films ever. Because
it kind of fell off with X3, but the first two are pretty solid.
We don't talk about X3.
We don't talk about Superman 2, and we don't talk about X3.
We don't talk about those.
We're going to compile a list of movies we don't talk about and then do a show breaking down all the movies we don't talk about.
Get some bourbon and some pills. It's going to get heavy. But with those films from that era, especially if you were a comic book reader, you didn't take any of that for granted, because before sequels and prequels and spinoffs, you might only get that one movie. And if you got a sequel, then you were really lucky. But to get a third, that's unheard of. And to get a spinoff, that was just something that you never thought could happen. So for those Spider-Man films during the Raimi period, I even, bring Blade up a lot, because I think Blade is an incredibly underrated, Marvel franchise. It was really the only first successful Marvel film franchise.
And it's coming back with Mahershala Ali.
Which I loved him as Cottonmouth in Netflix's Luke Cage. I'm so happy they're bringing him back. But, it's really that period where
I kind of just wish it was Wesley Snipes again. He's still kicking, right?
He could still do it. He looks like he's only in his 40s, but he's pushing 60 or something.
You know the phrase that I'm not allowed to say because I'm white? You know the phrase.
Black don't crack.
Thank you. You're allowed to say it because you're Puerto Rican. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's, it was really that era right before the MCU where it's like, you really had to value those things. And then when you start getting into the later, the 2010s, like around the 2008 Iron Man, that's really the crossing point where if you were a comic book fan then, you're in it to win it. You're it's ride or die right now. And it's one of those things where, people often wonder, are the comics for me? Because I love the films, but the comics are intimidating. I don't know where to jump in. I might not understand the reference. Those are all very, those are things that even I dealt with. I went through a 2-year period during undergrad where, one, I just didn't have time for comics. I was more interested in women. And two, I was also poor because I was more interested in women. So,
that was pretty much my path in college. Yeah. Lack of funds and the addition of other interests kind of dwindled my comic reading a bit.
Absolutely. So what you're going to see a lot of, folks, is we're going to talk about the big events. We're going to talk about a lot of the big topics. Of course, we'll be talking about everything from Secret Wars to Infinite Crisis to everything in between, but also
to
stuff
Secret
like
Infinite War Crisis
2. I mean, it's going to get heavy on those things, and we'll try and make sure that, we'll provide the references, and we'll jump into the other things. Why doesn't Batman kill? Why is Spider-Man, despite the fact that everyone sees him as a jolly, whimsical character, why is he one of the more darker characters once you get into the comics? Why is there that difference? We'll be talking about the films and why they went certain ways and stuff. This is going to be something where two things are going to happen. One, Mark and I are going to come prepared to kind of help guide you through these quintessential moments in comic book history and lore. But secondly, we want your input. This is going to be something that's really fan driven by the end of the day, because we're just like you. We're consumers at the end of the day. So, I mean, this is something where if you want us to really double down on something or jump on something different, I really don't think there are many shows out there where they're as willing to kind of help chart the course based off what really the listener wants. And at the end of the day, we want to be able to deliver that experience with you so we can enjoy this and have fun together.
Exactly. Yeah, we want your feedback from the beginning. We actually want your feedback from before the beginning. We're doing something pretty unique with this show. We've actually started our Patreon. We already have a patron before we've released a single episode. We have that patron while we are recording this episode 0. Anthony Meyer, our very first patron who joined at the epic crossover level. And if you head over to patreon.com/secondprint blah, blah, blah.
Blah, 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 blah.
You'll hear a lot of this on the show because I'm not going to edit that stuff out. If you head over to
us, folks. Be with us in the moment.
If you head over to patreon.com/secondprintpod, you can see what we'll be doing there over on Patreon, all the perks we're offering. But the biggest thing there is we want to get people involved in the show from the very beginning. We want this to be a very fan-oriented, fan-produced show. And there are various levels on that Patreon where you can get different levels of involvement, provide different areas of feedback. There's a level where you get to even produce a show. That's the Kirby Club every month. And we're just trying to really get people involved and get people to capture the same excitement that captured us as fans, that involved us in this world of comic books and all the sort of associated media that has sprung from them. And what I really hope to do, I think there's so much interest in these characters now. And like you mentioned, a lot of people just don't know where to start. So I hope that kind of by showing people the places we started and the stories that inspired us, the stories that got us excited about comic books and had us dive deeper and deeper and deeper in this stuff, we can kind of show people it's not that intimidating. If you can start at this place, we'll try to give you background on some things, because any story, there's 30 minutes or 30 years probably, I should say, of background that we can give on it. So we'll try to do our best.
We're going to start giving Apocalypse Now level background commentary.
Exactly. We're going to actually produce 500-page ebooks along with each episode with the reference points.
And they're going to be in volumes, and then we're going to go through a period where we don't print often, and then you're going to have to go ahead and get the Redux versions. Exactly. Yeah, none of that shit's going to happen.
Then we'll have the foil cover for episode 500. We'll have the foil
variants
cover
as well. We can't leave out the variants where they'll just be, if you see red on some issues, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking some of our blood and mixing it together with the ink. So then you can have some of us with you.
And then at a certain Patreon level, you can mix your own blood in with that ink. We didn't talk about that off air, so I hope you're okay with that.
It's fine. I'm not COVID positive. But see, folks, we're willing to do anything for you. But I mean, it's
we will even provide you COVID antibody tests. I don't know how, but we'll figure it out.
You want people, guns, gold? Like, what do you want? This is for you. Seriously, all jokes aside, I'm so happy to be doing this with Marc. I know Marc has been wanting to do this for a while, and what we bring with our combined, decades worth of podcasting experience through our other platforms is that we're going to make this really something that we want you to be excited about. And the one thing that I wanted to do that we're offering through Patreon. And, if you sign up for Patreon today, you're going to get a bonus episode where Marc and I are really going to expound on this. So by the time you're listening to this, if you want some extra behind the scenes stuff, you can find that out. We're actually going to be mailing people at the $25 level, the epic crossover level, a hardcover graphic novel. And this is something where a lot of people are like, oh, do I buy it through stores? Do I buy it through Amazon? What versions do I get? Folks, we're going to hook you up with that. That's one of the things.
Decisions for you.
Absolutely. You won't know what's coming, but you're going to like it. You're going to like it. And if you don't like it, send it back to me and I'll keep it.
If you don't like it, you got to pay for shipping to send it back.
I will gladly keep it.
Remso, I want to talk a little bit more as we wind down episode 0 here, just more about our specific influences. I talked about how in the 90s I got into really first the biggest characters. Actually, believe it or not, my first comic book I ever purchased was an issue of Fantastic Four. And that has always been my theoretical favorite comic book, more for nostalgia purposes, just because that was
the world's greatest superhero magazine.
Yeah,
it was the first, right on the cover.
I loved the dynamic. I loved the tension. There was always so much tension with Thing because everyone else had these cool powers but still looked normal. But Thing was just this big, ugly monster, and that was always such a big theme. He would also always go out in public in his trench coat because he was just he never got over the shame he felt for how ugly he looked. And in the really early issues, not the issues I've read, but I've gone back and read some of the Silver Age stuff. There was more of a dynamic where he was kind of into Sue, into Reed's wife, and at some point we'll have to go back and do some Silver Age deep dives because, man, shit got real adult back then, like more so than you would think.
I was traumatized reading some of the Jack Kirby, Stan Lee original X-Men comics because I was okay. So here's one of the moments where I realized comics can get strange, but like in a soap opera way. That my teenage mind was like, I have to have more of this. I was, growing up, I was just addicted to Spider-Man. And I think I've always been a Spider-Man purist at heart because unlike every other character you really see between Marvel, DC, Image, Peter Parker was one of those characters that was the most like the readers. And really, that was the intent of Steve Ditko, who really helped Stan Lee flesh out who Peter was as a person, because he was affable, he was clumsy, he didn't have the best of luck, he fell on hard times, he went through difficult periods. And as a young reader reading this teenage superhero, that's where I really fell in love with this ability to have great art, great storytelling, and just real heart to it. But one thing that did really kind of, pull me into really understanding, there's more to this than just the story at face value. I think it's X-Men issue 2 where they encounter Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And Professor X is talking to Scott Summers, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. And you see the thought bubbles come up and he's just like, I'm so mad that they're so madly in love. Doesn't she know that I love her? And I'm reading this. I'm like, what the hell?
What is this?
She's like 16. You're bald in a wheelchair and old enough to be her dad. And I'm reading this and I'm just repulsed. And I'm just like, now I want more.
Yeah, things sure have changed in the comic book industry. That is for sure, and that's one thing we will also be examining over the years. What were some of your other favorite characters when you first got into things? Like the Fantastic Four captured me right away, but then I really got into Spider-Man for a lot of the same reasons. Maybe because he was a teenager and I was a teenager, and they just seemed like a character I could relate to more than I could relate to, say, a Superman, some alien from outer space. Also, the other character I always loved was Batman from the very beginning, just because I loved the idea of a character who had no physical advantage, had no superpowers. He certainly had advantages. As Ben Affleck would say, his superpower is being really rich. But really, Batman's superpower was his willpower and his intellect and his ability to always outthink every situation and outthink his opponents.
Look at any poll on Facebook. Batman versus anybody. Who wins? Batman. Batman, the animated series, like we were talking about earlier with the 90s X-Men animated show, Batman, the animated series, that really captured my attention. And I remember watching the Joel Schumacher Batman and Robin as a little kid on repeat on VHS. So yeah, I'm an elder millennial. I remember VHS tapes.
That is a bad movie that is enjoyable to watch if you have the right attitude going in.
I think you mentioned somewhere on Facebook. And folks, but before I forget, you can find us at Second Print Comics Podcast. See, folks, be in the moment with us. The Second Print Comics Podcast on Instagram and Twitter. Type that down. You'll find us.
Those are both at Second Print Pod. For both
at Second Print Pod. And I think you mentioned somewhere that you were watching, was it Batman Forever?
Yes, Batman.
What was it like watching that after not having watched it for a while? Assuming you haven't watched it in a while, because I have not seen that film probably again since 2013.
I did watch it somewhat under the influence, and we'll just leave that at that. So that probably did affect my experience quite a bit.
Ambiguous influence.
I will say Jim Carrey steals that movie. Absolutely steals that movie. You can tell because you have the two main villains are Jim Carrey as the Riddler and Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face. Now, Tommy Lee Jones is phoning this thing in. Tommy Lee Jones, I love him. He's a great actor. He's absolutely horrible in this movie.
He just wants that money. He just wants that Batman money.
He's just there for that Batman money. And, Val Kilmer is inarguably the worst Batman, I think. Clooney is even better than Kilmer, I think.
And Clooney had the bat nipples.
That's true. I think did Kilmer have bat nipples too? I forget.
No, he had he was the one that had the full on
pecs, but not.
He had bat pecs. He did not have the bat nipples.
No, bat pecs. No. Wow, we should really do some deep dives at some point on the old Batman show, the the Adam West Batman show.
I will take the Adam West Batman over Batman Forever and Batman Robin any day of the week.
Absolutely. But what I will say, and the other part, Nicole Kidman's character in Batman Forever. My God, what a slut. She's just a total whore. I think
that's why I watched that movie so much.
She is not portrayed as a feminist character in any way. First, she lusts after Bruce Wayne because he's rich. Then she lusts after Batman because he's Batman. And then she can't decide which one she lusts after. And then she realizes they're the same person. And it's absolutely ridiculous. But
you think people watch Michelle Pfeiffer in Batman Returns because of her stellar acting?
Michelle Pfeiffer. That's a whole nother story, Michelle Pfeiffer. But... whew, I don't want to get too hot and bothered here, my friend. But yeah, I do recommend Batman Forever for people who can enjoy campy bad movies for what they are, which are campy bad movies. Do not expect the Dark Knight here on this one.
No, not at all. But it's those moments that whether it was the weird Professor X scene in the first couple X-Men comics, as I mentioned, being in the comic book side of things, or just those movies where it's like, if it wasn't the fact that it was a Batman property that guaranteed they were making a lot of money, you'd be surprised if those films ever came about again, which is why when Batman Begins came out in 2004, 2005, people were taken back because they didn't know whether they could take it seriously or not.
Like, we're doing this again?
And nobody saw what was coming at all. And I think that's really a testament to the medium itself, to this genre, that it can go through the Adam West campy phase and then the bat nipples phase and still give you a Dark Knight.
And still give you Christian Bale's portrayal of Batman with this voice the whole time, which really takes you out of the moment sometimes.
Because
my voice is a little crusty today, so I couldn't get the full bail.
Yeah, it's like he must have had to go through a pack of cigarettes before that each time. But yeah, it's one of those things where I'm happy now that because technology and just really the ability to create good content like what we're seeing in films and animation, everything else, now people can see in a big way what you and I saw in really two different eras of the comic book, history of lore, what we saw the potential there to be.
Right.
Because in our minds, we always knew if they made an Endgame movie, it would be absolutely insane. But now people actually get to see it. And then they look back at the comics and the shows and everything else. And then they're like, oh, the nerds were onto something.
Right. These nerds were onto something all along. And that is why we're here. We're here for you people that realized that us nerds were way ahead of you on this stuff. And there's so much cool stuff, so many stories to be told, so much to learn from comic books. I mean, some of the morality plays that you see in here, the stuff that I might not have realized as much when I was a kid that you really see play out in some of these stories now, especially as an adult when I can go back and reading them. And we won't get into it now because it's going to be one of our first episodes, but I had never read Secret War, not the original Secret Wars, but Secret War, Nick Fury's Secret War. That's the first episode you'll be producing. And that one blew my mind. Like, I couldn't believe what I was reading.
That is some next level stuff, right?
And we will leave the teaser there because we're going to do a whole episode about it. So I'm just going to tell you, boy, and it was so adult and so real that it made me feel uncomfortable. That's how close to home that it was hitting.
That's how you know it's good.
That's how you know it's good. When you're uncomfortable listening to this show, that's how you know it's good too. So it's the same thing.
Mark, I'm excited. I know the listeners are excited. How about you go ahead and wrap things up for us?
All right. Well, why don't we I'm thinking we just do a quick preview of maybe what people are going to see from the first few episodes.
Let's do it.
Just to give a little teaser. So the basic format of this show is Remzo and myself are going to be alternating, essentially producing duties. So every week, one of us will take a story from the past or maybe a character or a big event or maybe even a movie. We can do whatever we want, man, because we're the producers. And that person will be presenting, presenting the story, kind of breaking it all down, and then we'll do just kind of what we did here, just riffing off the cuff about it. And but the first episode that I'm going to be producing, we're going to be looking at the launch of the second X-Men book in the 1990s, 1991, when previously, well, the original X-Men book eventually became Uncanny X-Men, but the X-Men became so incredibly popular that they decided to launch a second X-Men book, simply dubbed X-Men. They brought back the original, one of the original classic X-Men writers, Chris Claremont, to team with Jim Lee, who at the time, and even now, is one of the biggest comic artists of all time, one of my favorite artists of all time, and they really put everything behind this launch. So we're going to get into not just that first issue and all the hype around it, but everything that led up to it, the original stories, and kind of the fallout from that as well. So that's my first episode. What's your first episode going to be? Well, I just spoiled it for you actually a minute ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be talking about Secret War, the 2002-2003 version that was done by Brian Michael Bendis. And this is the comic that really showed me that comics, really just this superhero genre is ultimately always going to be a reflection of the world outside your window. And with Secret War, what you're dealing is with, a giant clandestine espionage agency, as in S.H.I.E.L.D., dealing with stuff that, growing up in a post 9/11 world, you're watching this and you're like, wow, they could have ripped this off of the news. This is stuff that we could be discussing right now. If obviously Spider-Man was swinging around New York, obviously not. But this is what showed me, wow, comics can take serious issues and throw it into this genre and make you experience something completely different. That's going to be the first one that I really want to cover. But the one thing that I want to show you, and I know this was definitely a story arc that Mark did not read before because it was around 2009, 2010. We're also going to
that was during my comic, one of my comic dark periods.
The comic hiatus, the dark ages. We're going to talk. We're not just going to talk about stories and arcs. We're also going to talk about really the themes that we see through this genre. And one of them is a question that they've asked this not only as characters in the stories, but us as fans, as a society molded by superheroes, have asked ourselves. And one of the biggest ones is, does the world need Superman? Obviously, in the comics, it's, do we need this godlike alien person who shoots lasers from his eyes really protecting us? In our world, it's, do we need a character who's so Boy Scoutish and so, in many ways, old-fashioned, truth, justice, the American way? Do we still need Superman? So we'll be covering probably one of the most unpopularly written stories, but obviously one that has a cult classic. It's the Superman grounded story arc, where he doesn't punch an alien, where he doesn't have to deal with Lex Luthor, Dance of Doomsday. It's where he's just going to go ahead and basically do a Superman level road trip and just hang out with schmucks like us. What does it say when Superman asks himself that question? And that's something I'm really looking forward to.
Road trip on foot.
Only Superman could walk across the country and not grow a beard like Forrest Gump when he's just running and running.
Right.
What was your experience? Because I made you read that one and you were like, I had never heard of this, but I'll go ahead and check it out.
Well, I'm going to reserve my commentary for the episode because I have not gotten through the whole story yet. So we're just going to leave that
teaser,
as a little
teaser.
I will say there was a moment in the first episode in the first issue where I was very angry at Superman. Very angry at Superman to the point that I almost wanted to rip up my digital book, but that would have meant just breaking my Kindle, so that wouldn't have been really very helpful.
Why'd you break your tablet? Superman did something I didn't like.
Yes. So that's a little teaser. You can look forward to me having an angry rant against Superman, and that will be episode 4. So one more book I want to mention, just to kind of round out some of the stuff we'll be talking about in our first few episodes, is a book that I think is probably the least heralded of the Image books. When Image kind of broke away, it was Eric Larson, Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, a couple other guys.
Rob Liefeld,
yes.
Liefeld!
And they each had their own little kind of little universe within the broader Image universe that they were trying to create. I bought all those Image books in the beginning. I bought Wildcats, I bought Spawn, but for whatever reason, the one that really, really captured my imagination from the very beginning beginning was Savage Dragon, Eric Larson's Savage Dragon. I don't know any other Savage Dragon fans in real life. The only ones I know are the ones I find online. I used to go on the Savage Dragon forums. Now there's like a Facebook group where I see some fan talk, but it's like this weird niche comic that I think is just one of the greatest superhero comics ever made, and nobody knows about it. So that's another reason people know about it, but it's just not that popular.
I have never, but before we did this show, I had never picked up a Savage Dragon comic in my life.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's the least heralded of those big Image books. I mean, when you think of the Image launches, you think of Jim Lee's Wildcats, you think of Todd McFarlane's Spawn, but man, the most consistent, the most entertaining, most consistent unquestionably, because Eric Larson, I just read Savage Dragon number 249, and the next issue will be the big issue number 250. Eric Larson has drawn and written every single one of those issues, including the 3-issue miniseries that preceded it. So really, that's 253 issues completely written and drawn. At one point, that did not last the whole time because he couldn't do it. At one point, he was also inking and coloring the damn book too. And I think he even lettered it at one point for a brief time before he realized this is insane. I can't do everything. But he is basically
wow.
This is not. I mean, I think Robert Kirkman had some amazing runs on Walking Dead and Invincible, both books that we'll definitely get to at some point.
Absolutely.
But that was just the writing, which is impressive. But Eric Larson's done everything. And there are things in this book. There are moments in the early moments of this book, like in episode, I want to say issue 16, and it gets referenced and totally comes back around in like issue 2 something. You know, it's like it's really incredible what he has put into building this universe. And I just can't wait to talk about this book further and introduce more people to it. So I'm excited to get you down that train as well, because I think if you're into and you mentioned you are a fan of Invincible. I think if you're into Invincible, you're going to see a lot of it's kind of similarities in the style.
Oh yeah, I mean, if Spider-Man is you going through your later teenage years with spider powers, Invincible is you going through your Superman phase while hitting puberty.
Totally. Yep. Exactly. So Invincible will definitely be on our list too. That's a comic that I only read a year or two ago, and I went through the whole thing. Like I just picked up the first trade and then I couldn't stop.
And timing is perfect too, because the animated series is coming out.
Oh, is that true?
Absolutely.
I
it's
was
coming
not
out
even aware
in
of that.
2021, next year. They've already started putting everything together. First, they thought they were going to do a movie a few years ago. Now they're like, let's just do an animated series.
Awesome. Well, maybe as we get closer to that launch is when we'll start doing our own Invincible deep dive there.
Absolutely.
A couple of other things I do want to mention before we finally wrap up here and let you go listen to the rest of our episodes. One thing, we have a group on Facebook right now. It's called the Second Print Comics Fan Zone. We added a few people just to get things going, people we know in the comic book community, friends of ours that are into comics. That is going to become a Patreon-only group. Once it hits, what do you say, Remso? I'm thinking once it hits 50 people, it's completely closed.
Yeah.
All right. So if you want to go join now and not have to pay us a dime to do so, just go over to Facebook, type in Second Print Comics Fan Zone. It'll pop right up and we'll let you right in. But once we hit 50, we're going to put a hard cap on that. And then at that point, the only people that are going to get in that Facebook group are going to be our Patreon supporters. So it will be a Patreon only perk. But because we want to build things up a little early, get people interested, we're giving you this sort of window of opportunity to come join us in the exclusive Facebook group, Second Print Comics Fan Zone. So if you want to get in now without paying us a dime, of course you can pay us a dime. That's always an option. Don't forget.
That would be really awesome of you.
Yes, you can actually mail me a physical dime if you so choose. But beyond that, we will have plenty of Patreon perks. Again, head over to patreon.com/secondprintpod. We're going to have a video up there breaking down all of the tiers and everything we plan to do over there on Patreon, in addition to the free podcast that you will get here each and every week. So please do follow us anywhere and everywhere. Again, Twitter @secondprintpod, Instagram @secondprintpod. That is basically how you can find us just about everywhere. We also have a website, secondprintcomics.com, where you can find, we're not only going to have our podcast there, but we're also going to start doing some reviews and maybe some random rants. Who knows what we'll do? It's our playground. We just want you to come and play in it with us.
It's a podcast with infinite worlds, folks. Infinite worlds.
Exactly. Remso, any final words before we ascend into the actual episodes that we're going to be recording here?
I mean, we covered so much ground, and I'm so excited to get to journey into mystery as we go forward with this podcast. folks, definitely get involved with us. This is your show. We're excited to get to kind of steer this ship in the right direction. And, as I'm going to tell you going forward, read comics, change the world. I'm Remso W. Martinez.
And I'm Marc Clair.
And we're out.